Do you see any similarities between Becoming Jane Eyre and Hotel de Dream? I mean, can you?
Well, some obvious ones, you know, that, well, there's, you know, two writers, obviously, Stephen Crane in Hotel de Dream and Charlotte Bronte, well, several writers in mine, and other things too. I was thinking, there's a book in the book, right?
Yes.
Although yours is, I believe, a made-up book.
Yes.
Stephen Crane never did write The Painter Boy. So that was where I admired your courage to take, after all, Stephen Crane was a heterosexual man, and in Ed's book, he writes a wonderful story, which is you're totally gripped by, of this young boy prostitute. Well, it's about an obsession, right? Am I right in saying that?
Love,
Theodore's obsession with this young, very sick boy. It's obvious that he's sick, right?
Yeah.
So in both these books, we do have that device of using a book in a book. And so in some ways they become books about writing. And that's one of the things that I remember being told as a student. And I have to tell you that Ed, I first met and was my professor very briefly. He was at Columbia, and I could have taken his class on Proust, which I did not take, to my eternal regret. But I did go once, and he was teaching that day. It was a seminar. He was teaching a story by Chekhov, a story called In the Woman's Kingdom. And I will always tell this story because, you know, you study with many people over the years, but you don't really usually remember anything they said. But in this case, I remembered something essential that he had told me. And that was in the story. I don't know if any of you know this Chekhov story. It's a wonderful Chekhov story. The woman receives, she's a factory owner, and she receives a sum of money. And the question is, what is she going to do with this money? And that's the question that drives the story. Not just that, of course, it's the surface question. And Ed pointed out to us that that was what we needed in a story, and that was a question that your reader wanted answered. And that would keep your reader tied to the page.
And that wouldn't be a moral or ethical question, but that would be a very practical one, like, will Hamlet avenge his father's death? And that's the question that is asked throughout the play. Yes, no, maybe he will. Oh, he's about to do it, but no, he's not. And you know, but there's always that one question, a dramatic question that could only be answered by an action.
Right. So anyway, so I'm making a digression here, Ed, but there are many similarities, and probably I may, to some extent, have been inspired by your wonderful book.
Well, but I'm sure you're inspired by Jane Eyre, first and foremost. It's such a wonderful book, I think, and one of the things that I admire about it the most is how supple it is in jumping around without ever confusing the reader from one period of their lives to another, from one point of view to another. I mean, at certain point, I mean, it begins with Mr. Bronte, the Reverend Bronte, has just had an operation on his eyes, and he's lying there in the dark in Manchester in a hired rooms, and his daughter Charlotte is writing Jane Eyre, and it just starts with this sound of the pencil on paper, and of course there's an obvious allusion in a way to Milton and his daughters reading to him, and he's being blind, and Milton is one of his favorite writers.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that was true. I mean, that was documented. Yes, that he really did. Yes, people have asked me why I began with a sound, this beginning of the book. Well, first of all, as Ed said, the man was reduced to just this one sense. But perhaps I thought about it I do also have a daughter, my middle daughter, who is deaf. And so sound has always been, words, extremely important to us in the family, I suppose. And so maybe, who knows, you don't know, where these things came from, but maybe something.
But your book does a lot of tracing out where these things do come from. But without ever being heavy-handed, and that's what I like about it so much, is it's never Freudian, it's never drawing kind of thumpingly obvious parallels between Charlotte Bronte's life and Jane Eyre's experience. But you do conjure up lots of parallels.
Yes, but I did try not to suggest that, she just simply wrote her life down. And that's something that, I think we could talk a little bit about this evening, and that is, how do you take these facts? And I'd be very interested to hear from Ed how, what was the process going from the facts into the actual fiction. And I didn't want to suggest in my book that, Charlotte Bronte just wrote down her life, because of course it's not that simple. And in fact, there's a little anecdote in the book where she finally meets this great, great author that she's so in admiration of. In fact, she dedicated her book to him, and that's Thackeray. And Thackeray introduces her to his mother, I believe, and he says, "This is Jane Eyre." And she was furious, because of course she was not Jane Eyre, and I didn't really want to suggest that either. But obviously there's a great deal of her life in this book. And certain of her experiences were essential for her to write something of that kind. Her going, I think one of them, obviously very important experiences, was the one that she had with her professor, where she goes to Belgium and falls in love with Monsieur Heger, who was probably a very seductive teacher, and but I'm sure nothing ever happened. And probably the kiss that I supply there was totally imaginary. But anyway, she was definitely in love with him and wrote many letters to him. So that was one experience that I felt there must have been some love affair there somewhere for her to be able to...
and of course she conjures it up in Villette. I mean, that's the whole plot of Villette. And I always thought the wonderful thing in Villette is that the professor is quite homely when she first sees him, and only gradually does he become handsome. As I think oftentimes happens in love, is the more enamored you become of somebody, the more appealing they are, even if they're far from being conventionally good looking. One of the things along those lines of looks that I found so deft in your book is that Charlotte Bronte is always looking at her sisters and admiring their looks and seeing something beautiful about their eyes, and you think that of them all as being quite attractive because you're only really perceiving them through the eyes of other members of the family. But then finally, when Charlotte becomes a famous writer and goes to London and meets her editor, and the editor forces his mother, who's kind of a grande dame, to come along and accompany them all to the opera. The mother hasn't been told that this is Jane Eyre because the son is holding this as a little secret from his mother, and she keeps looking at these appalling tiny women from the country wearing these terrible clothes, and who are no longer young, and because she's come with Anne, her sister Anne.
Right, and this makes me think of your Fanny Trollope, because in Ed's wonderful book,
Fanny, he has Fanny Trollope, who is the famous Trollope's mother, is writing Fanny Wright's story. And she, too, I gather from just glimpses, is very homely. And at one point, I think you say something about her snaggled teeth.
No, she sees a funny-looking little old woman at this brilliant assembly, and she says, I wonder who let in that funny looking lady. Then she realizes it's a mirror.
Which is what happens, I'm afraid.
I'm afraid.
And certainly, this is what we get in Ed's work, and these glimpses of truth.
And she even takes her teeth and shoves them in the mouth because if any ride's coming, someone's coming.
Yeah, she has these teeth that she kind of wander around the room, but she'll put them in when she...
Well, I wondered how on earth that was possible. Is that a document?
I can't remember. But you brought up an interesting and more serious question about the interplay between fact and fiction when you're writing a historical novel. And I found that when I wrote Hotel to Dream, that I was working at the 42nd Street Library because I had a fellowship there, as you did previously, and so it was wonderful because I had access to 7 million books and 30 librarians, and it was wonderful to be able to. For instance, just one tiny thing is, one day I realized that my characters should all go to this rather fancy hotel of the period that was on Union Square, and then I thought, well, what would they be eating? And so that library has a complete collection of menus of every hotel of the 19th century. So you just look up a certain day and, oh, it was a roast goose, and you have the complete menu. You don't have to invent anything. And but in my case, I thought I would have this gay character of mine, Theodore, who's a banker and who's actually never had a gay experience before, and who's a married man, but falls wildly in love with this boy prostitute. And anyway, I thought I would have him think that since he can't spend very much time with this boy, that what he'll do is have a neoclassical sculptor do a lifelike sculpture of this boy, and then he can put that in his living room, and everybody will think that's perfectly normal. So and he does it. But then I thought, well, who would be the sculptor? So then I thought, well, who did the lions in front of him? And it turned out that it was this guy called Piccirilli, and
he's a wonderful character.
So then I thought, well, it'd be awfully convenient if Piccirilli himself were gay. Then I started reading his biography, and of course for the period, nothing was too obvious, but still, he didn't get married till he was 50, and he lived with the Italian ambassador to America, who was always being arrested for flirting with boys and